and I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this Public Health Sunbeds Bill debate today. And I think that, like everybody else, this bill has to be welcomed, and it is a very welcome development. And I suppose, just looking at it, I was wondering, sunbeds have been around for a long time, and the damage that they've caused has been known probably for just as long as they've been around. And you'd wonder why it's probably taken so long to get to the stage of having a legislative basis put forward in relation to controlling the sunbeds and the use of sunbeds. There's talk, and the Minister mentioned, about the increases in skin cancer and melanomas since between 1994 and today, and how the figures have increased so significantly. I wonder how much of that has actually contributed to the use of sunbeds over the last 20 years or so, and I would think that probably quite a lot of it is. So it's in that basis that while I welcome the bill, and I think we should have a legislative background to controlling the use of sunbeds, I just wonder why it's taken so long to come around and get into legislation. I think that's something we should be conscious of, and we should be looking in the future. There may be another product that will come along in the next couple of years or whatever that will have a significant impact, and I think we should, as a society, be quicker to respond to put in place a regulation and a process for controlling the use of these products. As has been outlined by other speakers, the World Health Organization has classified sunbeds as a Class 1 carcinogen, up there along with things like plutonium and tobacco. So you'd have to wonder what discussion took place in relation to whether sunbeds are actually necessary at all, and whether we should consider actually having a complete ban on them in the States, because obviously the public health impact that would have would be a lot more significant than trying to control the use of sunbeds and the access that people who are in vulnerable skin types or vulnerable age have to using the sunbeds. Because let's face it, the history of regulation in this country and the history of enforcement of regulation is abysmal. And this legislation will only be as strong as the enforcement that takes place afterwards. And I really, unfortunately, don't hold out much hope for effective enforcement of the regulation taking place after this legislation is passed. We have a great habit in this country of passing legislation and putting in place strong regulations and having them there on the statute books. And to all intents and purposes, it looks like that we have a strong basis for it. But when we actually look at the amount of enforcement that takes place, and when you look at even the difficulties that the HSE are under at the moment in relation to staffing levels, you just wonder, will there be any actual enforcement that'll take place afterwards? The Irish Cancer Society as well have called for a ban on the particular skin types from using sunbeds, the type 1 and type 2 skin types, I think it is. And I can understand the reasons that the Minister for refusing that in terms of equality legislation and the difficulty in having a selective ban. And I suppose that makes it even more interesting as to what the discussions and arguments were in relation to having an outright ban, when you see that so many, or that two skin types are very susceptible to melanomas and to the dangers of sunbeds. So I'd be interested in just to hear what kind of discussion and debate took place around that and around an outright ban within the department when devising this legislation. In response to a parliamentary question from myself, the Minister said that the cohorts of the adult population at increased risk from ultraviolet radiation can best be dealt with by way of regulation rather than a prohibition. And I can understand that and accept that as for the reasons I've outlined. But I wonder, will regulation and place an obligation on the operators of sunbeds to warn people in advance of their skin types and the fact that they are at an increased risk, and make that very clear to them so that they can make an informed decision when they're deciding to use a sunbed. Because I think the regulation has to include that and has to make sure that people are identified by operators and extra warnings given to them if they are at risk of cancer from the use of the sunbeds. The other question I have in relation to the legislation is just in the bill places requirements on the hire of sunbeds as well, and that they shouldn't be hired to under 18s. And it's a thing I've noticed advertised over a few years ago, of sunbeds for hire, where they bring them to your home and you can keep them for a week or two or whatever and use them there. Will the bill include, or will regulations include, the fact that the people that are hiring those sunbeds may be over 18, but the people who have access, and the children may have access to those sunbeds and would be underage. So I wonder if somebody who hires a sunbed who's over 18 and meets the legal requirements, if they allow it to be used by somebody in the prohibited category, is that going to be an enforceable breach of the law as well? I think that's something that we need to see. And I think finally, last Corla, the main thing we need is we do need a publicity campaign around sunbeds and around the use of sunbeds, because this legislation, and I know the intention is to try and alter behaviour of people within society and people who are at risk, and that is very welcome. But the only way to achieve that as well is to get a wide-ranging publicity campaign going, so that people are aware of the dangers, aware of the new legislation, and aware of the behaviour that needs to change as well, because I think that's going to be ultimately the point to the success or otherwise of this piece of legislation, and the effect that it has, and hopefully in the future it'll have the effect of reducing the levels of melanoma in our society. But like I said, I would have concerns around the enforcement of the legislation and whether that will achieve its aims ultimately. But this legislation is welcome, and I wish it a safe, quick passage through the House. Thank you.